my name is Jim Campbell. I'm going to talk a little bit about Brown University, where I taught from 1999 to 2009, and I also want to acknowledge the John Nicholas Brown Center at Brown University, which is co-sponsor of this panel. Before I talk about the Brown enterprise, let me speak very briefly about some of the wider context internationally, historically, within which I think all of these initiatives are happening. It's an obvious point, but one that bears repeating, that our epoch is the bloodiest in human history. Scholars today debate the meaning of genocide, a term that was first coined in 1944, but even by the strictest definition, the last 100 years, I guess 102 years if you want to go back to the Herero genocide, has produced at least 10. The last century has also seen ethnic cleansing, another recent coinage, the systematic use of rape as a political weapon, a burgeoning international slave trade, the majority of whose victims are women and children, a steady erosion of the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and innumerable other grievous crimes. We live in an age of atrocity. Yet our era has also seen unprecedented advances in international humanitarian law, as well as in the wider field of what one might call retrospective justice. So accustomed have we become to international tribunals, to truth and reconciliation commissions, official apologies, reparations programs, and other historical redress initiatives that we sometimes forget how historically novel they are. To be sure, this emerging humanitarian regime has rarely, if ever, fulfilled the expectations of its architects, but it has ensured a measure of justice for at least some perpetrators of great crimes, and a measure of redress for at least some of their victims. Equally important, it has created an array of precedents and institutional forms for institutions and societies that seek to come to terms with gross historical injustice and its legacies. And I'd like to suggest that each of the initiatives that are being discussed on this panel are part of that. All of this is of more than passing interest for this audience. The blossoming of this new international reparative regime is emphatically a historical phenomenon. It is happening at a specific moment in time for specific historical reasons. It seems to me there's no one better equipped than we historians to try to fathom why that is. Indeed, I think there's a burgeoning field of what one might almost call comparative reparative studies, of historical comparisons of different institutions and different societies that have each in their different ways, in different circumstances, tried to face painful or traumatic pasts. These developments have also offered a field for political activism for historians, a place where our skills can be put to very effective political use. Now, of course, like most fields of political activism, it is a field that some historians may be reluctant to enter, in part because of our concerns about allowing our work to be something less than detached, to junior faculty's concerns that work of this nature won't necessarily be considered in considerations of tenure and promotion and so forth. But nonetheless, I think what we have here is an extraordinarily rich field, both for historical inquiry, for comparative historical inquiry, and for public engagement by historians. For all of their variety, all of these historical initiatives begin, all sort of historical redress initiatives, begin by trying to establish a clear public record of what happened against those inevitable pressures to deny, extenuate, and forget. And that, after all, is what we do. To make this of a special moment for this audience, one of the places, or one of the arenas in which this impulse to confront problematic pasts has been expressed in our society is within universities. And you have here a small sampling of a much larger number of universities that in recent years have elected to undertake some initiatives related to uncovering, coming to terms with, in some cases making amends for their own institution's historical relationship to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. The institution with which I was involved was Brown University. I don't have time to go into great detail about what the origins of Brown's Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice was. What I would encourage you to do is simply go to, there's a website which is up there. It's actually got an even easier URL than you see there. It's simply brown.edu/slaveryjustice, one word, and that will take you to the committee's, you can look at video excerpts of the committee's programs, you can read the committee's reports, there's a repository of hundreds of historical documents from the archives on the university, and so forth. So you can also see the report from the university about what concrete steps it's taking in light of the committee's findings. There's the a downloadable copy of the report, and so forth. The origins of this are kind of interesting. Brown was never a named party in any lawsuit, but at the turn of the century, the late 1990s and early 2000s, as there was a move, a kind of revival of litigation around the issue of slavery reparations, Brown was frequently mentioned in that context. Brown is mentioned by name in Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, one of the kind of manifestos of the reparations movement, as an example of an institution whose fortune rested in part on an unacknowledged slavery foundation. Brown was mentioned in the narrative portion of the first of the class action lawsuits against American corporations, the suit that was brought in 2003 against Fleet Bank, along with Harvard and Yale as another example of an institution whose wealth relied in part on a legacy of slavery. So we were sort of in the midst of this. And every time a reparations story appeared in the paper, and every time Brown's name came up, reporters called the university and said, so what's the story? And the university's response always, honestly, was, we don't actually know. And when Ruth Simmons was appointed to become president of Brown University, I think she found that appalling. That a university whose historical relationship to slavery had become a matter of public interest hadn't actually taken the time or the trouble to investigate what the facts of that relationship were. The episode was driven home further by an episode that took place on campus a few months, in fact, before President Simmons, who I should say parenthetically, because I think this is important to the way the politics of the thing played out, who was the first African-American president of an Ivy League university. The reparations issue was brought home to the campus by an episode shortly before her arrival, when a conservative columnist, David Horowitz, placed an inflammatory anti-reparations ad in a number of college newspapers, including the Brown Daily Herald. The title of the ad was 10 Reasons Why Reparations for Slavery is a Bad Idea and Racist Too. And with all respect to Mr. Horowitz, I think it really was an act of, or intended as an act of, kind of guerrilla politics to provoke a reaction, and it certainly did at Brown. Among the 10 reasons why reparations, according to Mr. Horowitz, was a bad idea was African Americans were vastly better off by virtue of the enslavement of their ancestors than had they been left behind in Africa. Reparations had already been paid in the form of welfare, and that any disparities between black and white people today were products not of history but of black people's own failures of individual character. Well, that was a pretty provocative ad, and it provoked a big reaction at Brown, where a group of students responded by threatening to prevent the Brown Daily Herald from circulating. And later that, exactly, you forget that they're 19 sometimes, don't you? The next day, when the newspaper was distributed, I'm not sure you can technically steal something that's free, but when the newspaper was distributed, protesters stole all the copies of it. They were at the distribution points. The day after that, Brown was on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the Wall Street Journal. It was on Fox News, you can imagine, MSNBC. It made the London Times and the BBC as an example of an institution where students had become so appallingly politically correct that when you presented them with ideas that made them uncomfortable, their only recourse was to smash the presses. Ruth Simmons had not yet taken over as president of Brown at that time, but she had recently been named to be president, and I think she watched this with considerable interest. And on her arrival, she spoke, in fact, her very first convocation address, she spoke about this.